Oh, good morning. I was just getting ready for church. Now I'm ready. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this virtual or Metal Arc Bible class, continuing in the series called Rooted Deeper Practices that's been facilitated by Brad Morrow. And I hope you watched his class last week on the word soul and loving the Lord our God with all of our soul. And today's class is going to be kind of similar to that in that Brad really had to explore that maybe there's some difference in language between what was originally meant by the word soul and what we think of today. Anyway, today we're talking about loving the Lord our God with all of our strength and how we can be deeper in our relationship with God, deeper in our love for God, deeper in the practice of our faith by this idea of loving the Lord our God and with all of our strength. And so, just to refresh, the original place you find all of this way that we're to love God is in Deuteronomy chapter 6, 4 through 6, a part or often called the Shema. And it goes like this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all of your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. And so we've got those three things here: heart, soul, and strength. And Brad's talked about some of those. I'm going to focus really sharply on that word today called strength and what it means. And it really doesn't mean what that English word strength implies. In fact, the King James Version calls it with all of your might, which might imply kind of power. And all those things get kind of close or in the vicinity of what the meaning is here. I think there's some more that we can learn as we go into that today. So, if we look at kind of the Strong's Bible Concordance or Bible Dictionary meaning of the words behind heart and soul and strength, when you get to heart, you have kind of things that make sense: the inner man, the mind, the will, the heart. That's nice. It's the exact word. The soul, understanding, and there's some other examples there. But anyway, like, okay, the English word heart and what the Hebrew word here meant, I can see the connection. Those things match. And when you go to the word soul and say English word soul, hey, what does the Hebrew word mean? The first example is soul, living being. Now, I will tell you, go back and watch Brad's class from last week if you didn't, because it really has a different meaning than just kind of this inner ghost almost. And I'm giving a short example of that, but still, the Hebrew word and the English word kind of have a connection. We can kind of see them. So those two kind of make sense. But when you go to the Hebrew word for strength and look at what some of the meanings are, suddenly you don't really get the word strength or might. Really, you get might in there, or force. That's one example. But as you read through these, exceedingly much. We're gonna watch a video later on in class that talks about what this word means, and basically in some contexts it just means very or very, very. But if you go down to that bottom section, look at the slide there. It says muchness. The Hebrew word means muchness, or as I've highlighted there in the slide, with muchness. And so suddenly, although heart and soul make sense kind of in Hebrew to English, strength and what the Hebrew word was trying to imply don't really connect very well. And so we got to kind of dig a little bit and figure out what that means. We're going to get some real concrete examples later, I think, that'll help us with that. So, I mean, this idea of with muchness, uh, if you and I were playing Scrabble together and you had laid out the tiles that spelled muchness, I would have insisted that is not a valid Scrabble word. And I would have been wrong. In fact, when I typed out muchness on this slide, spell check didn't give me any problems at all. It just said fine. And I thought, now that's odd. This is a word, a word I haven't really thought about before. But you know, it's not a real common word. In fact, like I said, we're probably kind of hearing it for the first time, and it even sounds wrong. But we're kind of going to dig into the definition of muchness today and see how that works together with heart and soul and what it means for loving God. Um, it's not as crazy as it sounds. So let's do a quick language 101 lesson for Americans, because we don't speak a lot of other languages typically, And I've often said that's not really a character flaw. We just don't really need to. We have a huge country surrounded by ocean on two sides, pretty much an English-speaking country to the north, and then a border to the south with another language. So we're as smart as other people. If we lived in another country where multiple languages was necessary, we'd learn multiple languages, but we don't really have to. So, but it's kind of important to know how language works a little bit. And basically that's this. Not everything in every language is translatable to every other language. In other words, there are words which are very common in a language and people use them every day. And when another language speaker says, what does that mean? It's not a one-word translation. And I've given some examples here of really kind of a same concept in Norwegian, Dutch, and German. I'm just going to pronounce the Dutch one, which is gezellig. Um, and in Norwegian is, I think, kuzelig, and German, ask Stephen Christy Martin. But basically, those words do not just translate to the English word cozy, although if you looked it up, that's exactly what it would say. And that's a very oversimplification of this one word equals one word in every language. A German or a Dutch or a Norwegian person, if you ask them what that meant, could probably talk for 15 or 20 minutes about what it means because it's so many things. It's unexpressible in our language what this one word means to people in this culture. I think that's important. So this kind of goes back to Brad's class on the soul, where he was kind of having to retrain us on what we think that word means versus what it meant to the people who wrote that word in their language in the first time. So anyway, this word for strength, which means with muchness, which doesn't sound like a very nice translation to us, it's kind of plunky, is pretty typical in language that things don't. So we have to kind of, when you're learning a language, people start pointing out examples of them. This is what it is, and that's what it is. And after a while, you know that it's a word and a feeling, and those two together are the definition, which I know is hard to explain or to understand. So anyway, it's important to know that Jesus used this same exact, well, he used Aramaic version of it, but he repeats the Shema here in Luke chapter 10, you know, where someone comes and says, hey, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus said, well, what do you think? And the person answers, love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbors yourself. And he gets it right. That's a really good answer. And Jesus says, you've answered correctly. Do this and you will live. So I only add in the words of Jesus so that we don't get caught up in the trap of, hey, Deuteronomy 6, that's Old Testament, it doesn't matter to me. But Jesus says, hey, do these things, including love the Lord your God with all of your strength, which is your muchness, and you will live. So I think we really ought to pay attention to that and make sure we understand what it means and really dive deep and get that root that we're trying to get in this class that goes deep and understand so that we can be stronger in our faith. So anytime, like I said, that words are kind of hard for us to understand or translate, I think it's important to just look at some examples. And I've got some examples from the scriptures that I think kind of get at this idea of whether people were or weren't loving God with their strength or their muchness. Excuse me. For example, Matthew 19, verses 16 through 22. This is about the rich young ruler who comes and says, hey, I've pretty much been very religious and I've kept all the commandments all my life. What else must I do to follow you? And Jesus replied, you shall not murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't give false testimony, honor your father and mother, love your neighbors yourself. And the guy says, I've done all that. You know, check, 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 and check. And he asks, what still do I lack, or what do I still lack? And Jesus says, if you want to be perfect, go, sell all your possessions and give to the poor, and you'll have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me. And when the young man heard this, he went away sad because he had great wealth. And so the reason I use this example is like he'd done a lot. He'd committed a lot of his life to God. He'd loved God a lot, but there was something that he loved more. In other words, he hadn't loved God with all of his muchness, with everything. with very, very. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. And so he went away sad because he not only hadn't he done that, he just couldn't see himself doing that. He wanted a Jesus that he could just do a lot of things correctly, but that Jesus wouldn't ask him to love him with everything he owned, to the point of giving it up. And so he went away sad. And we don't know the outcome of that story. We don't know if he came back, but there was something holding him back. He didn't give his couldn't love Jesus with everything, with all of his muchness, if you'll allow me that. So everything but, and he fell short. Um, and so I'm going to have these discussion slides, and you can just pause this after we talk about them. But there's a few of these scattered throughout the class. I don't have a discussion guide, but they're built into the slide deck. So here's the question: if you were the person in this story, what do you think Jesus would ask you to give up to follow him? In other words, what is that thing that would include all of your muchness, your everything, that you would give to Jesus? What would he know to ask you specifically that might be a challenge for you to give up? I'll let you discuss that for a while, and then we'll come back. Okay, I hope you were able to have some good discussion with whoever's there with you, or your children, or whatever. But let's go on. So another example, um, from James chapter 2:14 and the following verses. What good is it, brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? And so we can think of faith here as that mind and soul part, and deeds as that strength part from Deuteronomy 6. Can such a faith save them? Is that faith? Is that love, I could say, by extension? Goes on. Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, "Go in peace, keep warm and well fed," but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. And so this idea of energy and action and expressing that love we have for God, in this case others, with kind of physical movement or physical aid or energy or giving or doing something, I think implies this idea of muchness, of this idea of strength, this Hebrew word that's behind our English word strength. That it's the opposite of doing nothing. It's not just the feeling in our heart that we wish people were better and we love them with our heart, or our mind really thinks that they have concern for them. And if we can do something and don't, we've withheld our muchness from our love for those people. So close, but no muchness in that case. And then another example is, that without muchness, without doing kind of this extra step of love, we're kind of failing. Grade F, if that's not too harsh. 1 John 3:16 through 18. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his love for us. I've made some handy footnotes for you in the slide. 1, that's an example of muchness. Gave everything, including his life. So that's good. That's a positive. And we ought to lay down our lives. Again, footnote number 1, ought to. We ought to give our everything, our muchness, for our brothers and sisters. If anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Now, just going to pause here before I read the end of that verse. Pity here does not mean that feeling in the heart. Oh, that's bad. We just learned that from James. But it's not I have pity on them, therefore I love them. Because in the next verse it says, "Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth." So again, we get this idea of connecting strength from Deuteronomy, the Hebrew word, to action, to doing things. And so there's a couple things that I forgot to call out. That footnote number 2, if you don't have pity on them, that's lacking in muchness. We're not helping. We're not really loving fully as much as we can. And so here's another discussion slide for you. We hear a lot about these days, every last 10 years, about thoughts and prayers. Thoughts and prayers are with people. And admittedly, sometimes that's all we can do. When there's a catastrophe, sometime far away from us or we can't do anything, prayer is all we can do. And that's okay. But here's what I'd like you to discuss. Do you think that sometimes I'm praying for you can be a little bit like saying, go be warmed and filled, if there's other things we could be doing? Do we stop short and pray only when we could pray and do something, as kind of the picture shows on that slide? So I'll give you some time to think about, that maybe we take a shortcut sometimes with prayer only when there's more that we could do. Why don't you discuss that a little bit? Maybe even come up some times that you knew you could have done more. I hope you had some good discussion on that. Let's talk about this idea of muchness, this Hebrew word for strength, which means with muchness as kind of applied energy. That means energy that matters, energy that moves. Uh, Looking at Luke chapter 17, 11 through 19. Now, on his way to Jerusalem, Jesus traveled along the border between Samaria and Galilee. As he was going into a village, 10 men who had leprosy met him. They stood at a distance and called out in a loud voice, Jesus, Master, have pity on us. When he saw them, he said, Go show yourselves to the priests. And as they went, they were cleansed. One of them, when he saw he was healed, came back, praising God in a loud voice. He threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him, and he was a Samaritan. Jesus asked, Were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? The fact that 9 of the lepers clearly rejoiced that they were cleansed, I'm sure, of this dreaded disease. They might have even been thankful to Jesus, but they didn't apply any energy to going back to him to say that to his face, to really love him through the motion of returning to him. And I'm sure they could have found 100 other reasons to go show their family or to return their loved ones. But this idea of not just love in the mind, not just thankfulness in the mind or in the heart, but literally combining that with energy and motion and strength, if you will, this idea of muchness, to go express that thankfulness, and which is a form of love in this case to Jesus. So think about muchness as converting good intentions or feelings into action and motion and energy. On the other hand, it's important to not get too caught up on this idea of strength or muchness, because muchness by itself, energy, strength, action, motion, is not nearly enough. In Matthew chapter 15, 1 through 9, I don't have it all here, but it starts at the beginning of that passage with the Pharisees trying to trap Jesus and his disciples with the matter of the law, and he kind of turns the tables on them and says, You're supposed to love your mother and your father, but you're holding your money and some of your goods in reserve for so-called religious reasons and not taking care of your own family, your parents. And after he talks to them about that, he says, You hypocrites, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. This is the energy, strength, motion, action of our body, completely disconnected from our heart so that it's action only. And in this case, it's not even loving action. It's pretending to love God with their lips. But the way he really wanted to love them was not to just love God with their lips and their strength, but to take that energy and strength and their money, their everything, and share it with those who needed it. And so this idea of energy, strength, or muchness, like it's the thing we need to be pursuing, isn't complete. That's why we're looking at all these ideas together. We're looking at them individually, but they all fit together. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So not just muchness, not just strength and energy and action, but all of it together. And so this next slide isn't a great one because it's kind of got this diagram, like there's this flow between all these little aspects of love and how we love God and how we love others. But with that shortcoming aside, I want you to think about whether our actions, this idea of strength or our muchness, our our everything, follow out of a love that starts in the mind and flows to the heart or the soul and then expresses itself in energy and in action and muchness, or whether it can sort of work the other way, where our action, strength, and energy might lead us into a different kind of love in our soul, heart, and mind. And so there's a discussion question on that, kind of based on the classic phrase, you have to fake it till you make it. So I'd like you to think about a time when your heart and your mind really wasn't in that loving, want to do it for someone else kind of mood, but you did it anyway. You made yourself move, do, go, act anyway. And the question is, did that work? Does that build love into your heart and soul if you just sort of fake this muchness till you make it with action, or does it not? I'd like you to discuss that. Well, I'd like to show you a short video from the Bible Project. I know that Brad did this last week on his class about the soul, and we must be of the same mind and both love the Bible Project, but they just do a great job of taking the things I'm trying to say not very well and put it with art and explanation and word study and make it really beautiful. So watch this video that I think puts all these concepts I'm trying to talk about together in a very powerful way.
Thousands of years, every morning and evening, Jewish people have prayed these well-known words as a way of expressing their devotion to God. They're called the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And as for you, you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your strength. We're going to look at the last word, strength. The Hebrew word is ma'od, and it occurs some 300 times in the scriptures, and it doesn't actually mean strength. There is a perfectly good word for strength in Hebrew, and ma'od is not it. In fact, the Shema is one of the only places in the whole Bible where ma'od is translated as strength. So, what's up with that? The most common meaning of ma'od is very or much. It's what grammar nerds call an adverb, a word that comes alongside other words to augment their meaning. For example, in Genesis chapter 1, God looks at the world that he's made, and 6 times he calls it good. But then the climactic 7th time, he says, it is ma'od good. That is, very good. Later in Genesis, in the story of Noah, the flood waters keep rising and they become ma'od powerful, or extremely powerful over the land. In the story of Cain and Abel, Cain wasn't just angry at his brother, he was ma'od angry. Or when Saul became the king of Israel, he was ma'od happy. So you can see why ma'od occurs hundreds of times in the Bible. It's a really common Hebrew word that intensifies the meaning of other words. Very this, or really that. However, biblical authors could use ma'od in ways that are unique. Like when they want to increase a word's force to total capacity, they'll say ma'od twice. So Jacob became ma'od wealthy with flocks and camels and donkeys and servants. Or the Israelite spies went to investigate the promised land and they say, the land we pass through is ma'od good. So it's pretty clear, ma'od doesn't mean strength in terms of muscle power, but rather very or much. So let's come back to the Shema, where people are called to love God with all of their heart, that is their will and affections, and with all of their soul, that is their whole life and physical being, and with all of their ma'od, that is with all of their muchness. And while that sounds kind of funny, you also kind of get it. If ma'od can intensify any word's meaning to total capacity, then this final thing that you use to love God isn't a thing at all. It's actually everything. Loving God with your ma'od means devoting every possibility, opportunity, and capacity that you have to honoring God and loving your neighbor as yourself. It's the most wide and expansive word in the Shema. Ma'od can refer to almost anything. Which raises one last and really fascinating point. Because this word was capable of many nuances of meaning, ancient Jewish communities interpreted ma'od in the Shema in different ways. So the ancient Jewish scholars who translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek, when they came to ma'od in the Shema, they translated it with the Greek word dunamis, that is, power or strength. This is the interpretation adopted by most modern translations. But if you look at the ancient Aramaic translations of the Hebrew Bible, you'll discover that these scholars interpreted ma'od to mean wealth. Money is a concrete thing that opens up all kinds of opportunities to love God by giving away resources. And when Jesus was asked about the most important command in Scripture, he quoted the Shema, and he used 2 words to unpack the meaning of ma'od. He said, love God with all of your mind and with all of your power. Both are human capacities that can be used to love God in an infinite number of ways. So, which of these interpretations of ma'od is right? Does it mean strength, or wealth, or mind? That's the wrong question. The word ma'od doesn't limit the number of ways you can show love for God, just the opposite. The point is that everything in a person's life, every moment and every opportunity, every ability and capacity offers a chance to love and honor the one who made you. It's a call to love God with all of your muchness. And that's the meaning of strength in the Shema.
I think that video is just great. I think, the fact that they don't run away from the word muchness, they just kind of keep using it until we kind of understand it. It's kind of what I'm trying to do, only they do it just so well. I hope that was meaningful for you. Um, just a few more slides and discussion, and we'll be done. But as you guys all know, I like to make up my own statistics. I find it extremely convenient to make up facts and figures that I can use to my own advantage whenever I want, as you all know who know me well. And now I'm making up definitions. So when we look at this word strength from Deuteronomy and from what Jesus is saying, and we think about the Hebrew or Aramaic word or whatever, and we think about this idea of muchness, I've kind of made this definition. This word behind this idea of muchness or strength, is converting thoughts or feelings of love into energy, energized love. Kinetic love, moving love. So we're going to get movement or motion or going or words or action or speech or deeds or doing or serving. But there are all these kind of action words that I think mean, everything that's left after heart and soul and mind is muchness, but there's an action element to it. So converting thoughts or feelings of love into energy. And to sort of reinforce the point, I have an odd reference. Um, this next slide is about, for you aerophiles out there, I was kind of born into a military flying family, so we always were at air shows and knew a lot about airplanes. And so I knew a long time ago about this airplane called the T-37, nicknamed Tweety Bird. And it was an Air Force trainer. If you were learning to be a pilot in the Air Force back in the day, you would have worked your way into flying this. This would have been your first jet-powered plane that you would have trained in. And it was made by Cessna, and it was little, and it didn't go fast, and it had two very tiny engines, but they made a ton of noise, high-pitched kind of squealing noise. I encourage you to go onto YouTube and look for T-37 YouTube videos to see what I'm talking about. But the pilots used to joke that the T-37 converted jet fuel into noise. And so the source of what was supposed to be their energy, kerosene or jet fuel, when it came out the tailpipe of a T-37 was basically just sound. And the joke there is that, lots of noise, not very powerful. And so kind of my twisted metaphor here is that, this is the opposite of the idea of strength or muchness. It's whereas the T-37 converted jet fuel into noise, if we're, not converting our love into muchness, energy and kinetic movement, we're falling short on love, and we're just converting thoughts and feelings into noise and into things that aren't that useful. And so, just to summarize and close out, and we'll finish with prayer here in a minute, we should love God with our heart and our soul and our muchness would be the literal way to say what Deuteronomy 6 is trying to say. And that might be with our very, very, which might sort of more translate into everything. Our energy, our action, our doing. And we think back to the language examples of Norwegian and Dutch and German that we gave earlier in the class. It's hard to turn this Hebrew word into a very easy to grasp thing. But I think we'll know it when we're doing it, and I think we'll know it when we see it in others as well. It's not just thought and mind and heart and feeling, there's action and everything else. Our love for God is to accompany everything, and that's what I think this word for strength and muchness means. With everything else, we're to love God. I really appreciate you taking the time to watch this morning. Let's close with a prayer, and then I'll turn you loose. God, help us to understand what it means to really fully love you. Help us to work on that every day and to look for ways that we can not only think and feel the things towards you that we should, but also to convert that into action and to be willing to give everything we have to you in love and to others in love as well, Father. Thank you for loving us that way. You gave everything. You gave all of your muchness to us through your Son, Jesus. We pray in his name. Amen. Thanks, everybody. Have a great week.